What a difference an invasion makes. As EU leaders gathered for an emergency summit in the Paris suburb of Versailles, gone were the dissenting voices willing to cozy up to the Kremlin. From the far right to the far left, the excuses of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea have gone silent. Wednesday's shelling of a children's hospital in Mariupol, a reminder that the West has seen this movie before, in Chechnya, in Syria. Are chemical weapons next? If so, what are the EU's red lines? Like NATO, the European Union upping assistance to Ukraine, while so far shying away from putting boots on the ground, the 27 still hope that those unprecedented sanctions will suffice, alongside ever-increasing armament of the Ukrainians. Enter the limits of European solidarity. For its defense, the bloc remains dependent on U.S. might. For energy, on Russian oil and natural gas. Could this war prove a turning point? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if it's a moment of truth for Europe. With us, he was president of Estonia from 2006 to 2016, Tomas Hendrik Ilves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament Lesia Valisenko from the center-right Golozmin party joins us from the French city of Strasbourg. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you and good evening.
And if it's Thursday, it must be Versailles for France 24 EU correspondent Dave Keating, who's covering that summit. How are you?
Doing all right. We're waiting for some news out of the summit because all the leaders have gone inside now and they've started their meeting.
All right. Well, keeping us up to date there throughout the France 24 debate, where you can weigh in on the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Kyiv digging in. This as Russian forces have taken 2 northern suburbs, closing in on securing a third. Vladimir Putin's army progressing despite stiff resistance. Yuka Royer has more.
Beyond this barricade, Russian troops are in control. Brovary, just 20 kilometers east of the capital Kyiv, is now on the front line. The streets are deserted, but some residents are staying put.
Виховала синів, онуків, усе виховала. А чого я буду йти за своєї землі? Куди я буду йти?
Ukraine's defense ministry shared this footage on social media, showing what it said were Russian tanks in Brovary suffering, quote, significant losses and being forced to retreat as they tried to advance towards Kyiv. In another suburb on the southern outskirts of the capital, 80% of residents have fled, but a few, like this young couple, are preparing for battle.
Синочок був з нами весь цей час, але коли двічі прилетіло біля будинку, один раз 200 метрів за нами.
Если за пехотой, за БМП будет, вернее, за танками, за БМП будет идти пехота, то мы будем стрелять.
Central Kyiv appears to have come to a standstill, save for air raid sirens ringing over Maidan Square. But the city is not deserted. This shopping centre, whose precise location is kept secret, has been turned into a giant armoury.
Я доброволець, воюю, ми приїхали за певними речами і зараз їдемо до хлопців на передову, броніки.
As reservists and civilians become soldiers, volunteers are busy shaving their heads, preparing food and managing supplies. There's even a field hospital with nurses tending to the sick and injured.
Lesia Vasilenko, as we saw in that report, stiff resistance, but the Russians taking 2 northern suburbs and the fighting edging closer to the capital. What are family, loved ones, friends telling you this evening?
Kyiv is getting encircled. That was the plan from day one. The only thing that changed is that Putin was hoping to come in and take Kyiv in 2 hours, but he was met by a robust resistance, which continues to this day. And yes, we see that the Russian troops are closing in, but this gives us even more energy and even more confidence to fight. And this is what we are doing. The battle for Kyiv continues. It's been already days, and I feel that it will go on for days. The friends who I have who still remain in the capital, although they are few, but they report that sirens are sounding, not more and not less than usual. So it's the usual days of war. We are in 15th day of war. Tomorrow will be the 16th day of war. So as strange as it sounds, but we became used to the unusual.
And what's the drill for the Ukrainian parliament itself? What is it functioning? Is it on recess? How does it work right now?
The Ukrainian parliament is functioning. On the morning of the 24th of February 2022, we have voted on the martial law. And that law says that until the very end of the martial law, the parliament is in full function. And we are to be ready to be able to meet in parliament at any point when is deemed necessary to vote for the laws. We already had such a reunion, a parliamentary reunion, face-to-face, in person, in the very building of the Ukrainian parliament, and we voted something like 10 to 12 different laws and resolutions, all to reinforce our army, all to reinforce the civilian resistance, and all to make sure that Ukraine is still fighting and that Ukraine remains an independent state. And it looks like we will have at least 2 more sessions of parliament in person, and they may happen as soon as next week or in 2 weeks' time.
And does that mean you making the trip back ASAP?
Of course. So the reason why I am in Strasbourg is I am part of a delegation of women parliamentarians from Ukraine who are here addressing the European Parliament, what we have been doing all throughout the day today, and also preparing for the extraordinary session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is to meet on Monday and Tuesday and to discuss one question and one question only, that is of the deterrence of the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine and the expulsion of the Russian Federation from the Council of Europe once and for all, or at least until they stop their blatant aggression and get their soldiers out from the territory of Ukraine.
We've talked about Mariupol in the last 24 hours. We've talked about Kyiv. Let's talk about Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv. It's also holding out. It's been the target of heavy shelling. And these images, which have been verified by France 24's Observer's website, which fact checks, they include the overnight shelling of the brand new Nikolsky Mall in the center of town. Kharkiv was a direct target right at the outset of this 2-week-old war, Lesia Vasilenko. It's still holding out, though.
The people there, they are Ukrainian, and they will keep fighting like every single other city throughout Ukraine with all they have until the very end. And Kharkiv is the second most densely populated city in Ukraine. It's in the eastern Ukraine. So it was of utmost importance for Putin to get hold of that city, because then it would mean that his troops now control one of the major cities, which is also a regional center. So that makes it even more so important. But the people are not about to give up. And Putin's plan and his propaganda saying that he is in Ukraine to protect the people of Ukraine completely backfired. He was always mentioning that he's protecting the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. In Kharkiv, most of the population speaks Russian. It's a given fact. But even that doesn't change the fact that they are Ukrainian also, and that they will keep fighting for their land and for their Ukraine. So essentially, I think that Putin is in a lot of trouble there, because he now has no arguments, nothing to explain his intervention, as he calls it, into Ukraine, because essentially Ukraine is united against this blatant Russian aggression.
Russian audiences, meanwhile, this Thursday, getting the message that it's business as usual at the Kremlin. President Putin chairing a government meeting that was televised. There, he shrugged off to the West's response, quote, "These sanctions would have been imposed in any case." Your reaction to, let me ask you, President Ilves, your reaction to the way Russia has handled the past 2 weeks?
Well, it's clearly, I guess, to follow the advice given to drug dealers in the United States is that don't use your own product. And I think what they've done is believe their own propaganda about Ukraine, how it's weak, it's not a state. And if you continue to believe that and not believe the, I'm sure, rather decent quality information you get from your own intelligence services, then it's inevitable that you will charge off on this bizarre attack full of braggadocio, thinking you're going to now win, and then you run into all this stiff resistance. So too with the sanctions. I think they've kind of believed their own nonsense, not realizing how tough the sanctions would be, and probably miscalculated dramatically on the ability of the European Union, together with its transatlantic partners, to come together to insist on these sanctions and also to sanction the oligarchs. So we are seeing now the product of completely misguided behavior on the part of the people or one person deciding what's going on.
Misguided behavior, or is this a long thought plan?
Well, I think it might be in the mind of one person, but certainly, intelligence showed everybody that the Ukrainians were not going to back down. I mean, take the completely ridiculous assumption that, okay, we will replace Zelensky and then we will have won. You're not going to change the minds of 44 million people by changing the president of the country and installing a new leader there. It just won't work. I mean, this shows that they do not understand Ukraine or Ukrainians. So whether it was a long-term plan or a short-term plan, the main point is that they did not think it through.
They didn't think it through. You're saying there is, after 2 weeks, we're seeing increased shelling, of course, of civilian targets, and we're also seeing a little bit of diplomacy over in Antalya. The Russian foreign minister sitting down with his Ukrainian counterpart. But it was a testy Sergei Lavrov, more ominous, in particular when he was asked about Vladimir Putin's veiled threat to the West about using nuclear weapons.
We also heard Minister Le Drian, who said that France, too, is a country with nuclear weapons. And there have been other statements made in the West, Western countries, saying that this is going to be all-out war. President Biden, when asked if there was going to be an alternative to sanctions, to Western sanctions, well, he answered that the only other solution is Third World War. That's the only other alternative to these sanctions. So these are messages that we're hearing, and these are very concerning.
Tumas Hendrik Ilves, your reaction to that language, because that is the question on a lot of people's minds. How serious are the Russians when they invoke nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, I think the seriousness of Lavrov today was indicated by his statement that Russia is not invading Ukraine. We're in the Orwellian phase. I mean, black is white and white is black. And it's been very difficult to take Lavrov seriously for several years now. But in the last, since the beginning of the year, or with the ultimata that were given to NATO right before Christmas, you see that they're rarely tied to reality and what is within even the realm of possibility. So I've long abandoned taking seriously what Lavrov says in public.
All right, so that's regarding the public pronouncements there. But I asked earlier to Lesia what the mindset was inside Ukraine. I have to ask you what the mindset is inside Estonia. And just to remind our viewers, Estonia and other Baltic states, well, they bolted as soon as they could from the Soviet Union, unlike Ukraine refusing at the outset to join the Commonwealth of Independent States back in 1991. The only land border, you can see it on this map with the rest of the European Union, lies between Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, and Belarus, along what is known as the Suwalki Gap between Lithuania and Poland. That's the only land border between the Baltic states and the rest of the EU. What's the feeling in Estonia after 2 weeks of war?
Well, I mean, first of all, a couple of points. Number one, when we bolted, as you said, I mean, our attention was immediately devoted to, and we spent the following 13 years doing everything possible to join the European Union and NATO, including massive reforms that other countries really were quite sluggish on, but we were successful. Now, I mean, the main attitude in Estonia is one of trying at all costs and in every way possible to help Ukraine. I mean, for a country of 1.3 million, we've given 200 million euros worth of military assistance. We were the first to give javelins to Ukraine before anyone else got around to it. So there's that very strong element. Certainly, there's been a huge outpouring of sympathy for Ukrainians. The university is offering 400 places for Ukrainian. That's one university. That was the first to announce that we have, even when our police go to the border to take in refugees, they go there with candy and stuffed animals for the kids. So, I mean, that we're extremely positive about Ukraine and want to help in every way possible. On sort of our own fears, which occasionally I see people mention these things in the media, well, you know, basically we're NATO. And we count on Article 5, and Article 5 is not just that if Estonia is attacked or Latvia or Lithuania, that there will be that NATO will move. It's also true that Omsk and Tomsk suddenly become targets. So, I mean, that's also known as deterrence, and deterrence works. And as we have seen, the perfect case after Georgia 2008, Crimea and Ukraine 2014, and now deterrence works. I mean, that is why Ukraine so desperately wants to be in NATO.
Should Ukraine be in NATO?
Well, it's a longer, more arduous task. As I said, it took us many years to get ourselves in shape to join NATO. And that has not been something that was, I mean, neither in the case of the EU nor with NATO have we, as Ukraine, really made the kinds of effort that we remember so well from 95, 96 to 2004 when we joined. As we all know, it is even getting candidate status, which right now is not quite clear, that's only the beginning of a long, arduous reform process that takes place as a result of EU negotiations. So nothing comes overnight.
Nothing comes overnight. Before I turn to Dave Keating, Lesia Valisenko, did you bring your crystal ball with you to Strasbourg? When do you see Ukraine joining NATO, joining the European Union?
Well, look, first of all, I would like to disagree with something that has been said that, Ukraine is not really doing their homework, because we are. Even in the situation of ongoing war for the last 8 years and of the COVID crisis, which came on top of that, we have completed over 60% of our association agreements successfully, and we are still pushing for that even now as we fight off a horrendous escalation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And Ukraine has been good on its homework, but Ukraine is slightly that much bigger than almost any country in Europe. And so it makes it slightly that much more complicated to do some kind of processes. And I'm not defending, we could do better, we can always do better, but under such circumstances, we have done already a lot, and everybody admits to that. And the fact that we are today fighting for the sake of all, first of all, the Eastern European states like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Latvia, like Estonia, like Lithuania, for them not to fall, because if Ukraine falls, they are next. And I think the whole world knows it well enough. And today what Ukraine is doing, when we are holding up our skies and holding out every single night, when our hospitals, our kindergartens, our schools get missiled by the Russian Federation, we are holding up not just the skies for our own safety. We are holding up those skies for the safety of the whole of Europe and for democracy and human rights and concept of sovereign states to exist still in the world tomorrow. So I think that we have earned that right to become members, full-fledged members of the European Union and of NATO, and the holding off of the decision, it's a political choice. You can make the choice of keeping Ukraine waiting and of putting us on the same line as Georgia and Moldova, who are also waiting for that decision, or you can actually admit the efforts that we have been doing, that we have done in the past, and that we are doing presently now, and accept us back into the European family and into the European Union as a country which is literally sacrificing itself for the well-being of democracy in Europe. And that would also be a very strong signal, politically, of support to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army, and also a very strong political signal to Putin, saying that that's it, game over, the choice is done.
Thomas Hendrik Ilves, very briefly on this.
Well, you really should acquaint yourself with the process of accession to the European Union. I mean, I'm one of the biggest supporters, and have been for years, of Ukraine. Nonetheless, in order to take over the acquis communautaire, you just don't become a member. You have to negotiate, and this applies just as much to Finland, Sweden, and Ireland, and the UK as it did to Estonia. You just do not become a member of the EU. So that's point one. Number two, just politically, probably not the greatest idea to go around telling us we're next. It really is. I mean, too many people do that. It really has the opposite effect, and it decreases the seriousness with which you can be taken if that is a line to take.
Dave Keating, let me ask you, you heard earlier President Ilves mentioning weapons supplies to Ukraine. And we've seen how that has gone crescendo from NATO members and also from EU states that are not members of NATO. French daily newspaper Le Monde quoting sources this Thursday saying that Milan anti-tank missiles are being provided in small numbers by France and Italy to Ukraine. What's the mood when it comes to armament at that summit where you're at?
This is precisely what they're talking about tonight. And really, this is a watershed moment that they're even talking about this. The EU has never armed an ongoing conflict before, and it's usually left these kind of military matters to NATO. So this is it's a new arena for the EU. It's not completely new. The EU has already been involved in military cooperation for some time. The idea of European Defence Union, which has been championed by French President Emmanuel Macron, has been around for a while. But it's always had a lot of resistance. And I think what's changed over the past week is that even the skeptics now really see the necessity for that. And we heard that just now from the EU prime ministers and presidents as they were coming into the Palace of Versailles behind me. We heard over and over again that this is the the time for the EU to up its military spending, for EU countries to get serious about defense. We even heard it from the Swedish Prime Minister. Sweden is a historically neutral country, not in NATO, but she said that Sweden and all other EU countries need to increase their defense spending. And indeed, Sweden just announced today that they're going to increase their defense spending to 2% of GDP, which coincidentally is the NATO target, even though they're not in NATO. So I think what's changed, it's not that this is an entirely new idea. What's new is that there is now, you really feel almost universal consensus around this. That being said, there are difficulties with this. I mean, they're talking here at the summit tonight about clarifying the language about mutual defense for the EU. There's a paragraph about this in the Lisbon Treaty, which was signed in 2008, that's a bit vague. And it's not entirely clear if EU countries need to declare war on a country that attacks an EU country. And they've talked about maybe in this declaration that they come up with here in Versailles about clarifying that, making it more clear that yes, EU countries would have an expectation, but you can expect that the neutral countries, in particular Ireland, would not be comfortable signing something like that. So there's still a split in terms of how far they want to go, but there's a consensus that more needs to be done militarily in Europe.
And more needs to be done militarily in Europe. And to see how much things are changing, you had earlier in the week the United States pouring cold water on the idea of NATO supplying Ukraine with Soviet-era fighter jets. But with members, as Dave describes, stepping up arms shipments, we're even hearing the likes of Germany up to a point changing their stances.
We've provided humanitarian services. We've also provided all equipment possible. And as you know, we've provided them with weapons. For the rest, we have to think carefully about what we're actually doing. And that certainly does not include fighter jets.
Dazu gehören ganz sicherlich keine Kampfflugzeuge.
Dave Keating, you mentioned Ireland and Sweden. With Germany, there's a historical context here, which is since the Second World War, it's been very reluctant to supply weapons. And this is a real change.
Yeah, indeed. Germany didn't have the same neutrality positioning as other countries that are in the EU, like Sweden, Finland, Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. But Germany kind of was toward the neutrality end. It was in NATO, of course, still is, but it was very reticent to increase military spending, and it had this ban on sending arms to active conflict zones. Not just Germany itself sending those arms, but also any arms that were made in Germany. So last week we had a situation where the Netherlands and Estonia wanted to send arms that they had to Ukraine, but because those arms were made in Germany, they had to get German permission, and Germany's official position was always to say no to that. So Germany changing its position on this is also a big watershed moment. Germany not officially neutral like those others, but I think everyone's moving toward that direction. Wherever they were before, everyone's moving toward the direction of armament and toward the direction of increased military spending.
Toward the direction of increased military spending. It's, of course, not going fast enough for the Ukrainians, they'll tell you. I'm sure Lesia Vasilenko will say that in this dire moment for your country. We did hear the host of the summit describe what's happening as one of those seminal moments for the European Union.
L'Europe doit changer.
Europe must change. It changed under the pandemic, and it will change even faster and more strongly due to the war, because the war in Ukraine has profoundly shaken us, put us off balance in terms of beliefs our continent had won. So it will lead us to become more lucid, ambitious, and to make worthy decisions.
Thomas Hendrik Ilves, you agree?
I certainly hope so. I do think that this is a defining moment for the European Union, that actually which I'm, again, very much in favor of, that when things get serious, the EU too gets serious. So I'm quite optimistic that out of this horror that Europe gets its act together.
And getting its act together means what exactly for you?
Well, first of all, getting serious about defense. I mean, we have since basically 1954, even before the EU, attempted some kind of defense cooperation, and so far it hasn't panned out. I mean, right now we're calling it PESCO, and and they've been working for I don't know how many months on a strategic compass, in quotes, but that's what they call it. I don't know what they've done with their strategic compass since we've had a war, which completely should change the way the compass points. So we'll have to wait and see. But certainly on my part, I would love to see much stronger, not only military integration, but let's face it, we don't have the kind of structures such as a central command. We don't have a Security Council or a North Atlantic Council that meets every day to look at the security situation.
But wouldn't that be overlap? Wouldn't that be overlap with NATO?
It might be. I mean, but if you want to get serious in the EU, then you have to deal with that issue, even if it is overlap. And certainly, I think after the U.S. administration of 2017-21, this will be inevitable anyway, because you can't be sure how long the United States will be in NATO, as we've seen even rather recently. Donald Trump say that he was going to pull out of NATO in his second term.
And Dave Keating, that's kind of high on people's minds as well. Right now, Joe Biden is in lockstep with the EU when it comes to taking on Russia, but it would be a different case if Donald Trump had been reelected.
That's absolutely true. And of course, Europeans can watch the news in America. They can see that a significant portion of the Republican Party is actually cheering Putin on. Not all Republicans, but a large amount. And of course, Trump has called Putin a genius for his invasion of Ukraine. So Europeans are very aware that in 2024, they could completely lose that partnership. And that has been President Macron's point for so long, that this idea of strategic autonomy, it's that Europe should be able to fend for itself. It should be, in terms of energy, not reliant on Russia for energy, and it shouldn't be reliant on the United States for military protection. And I think that this shock of the Russian invasion has woken a lot of other EU leaders up to this idea. We heard from Mark Rutte, who has not really been out in front about defending strategic autonomy before.
The Dutch Prime Minister.
Yesterday saying, essentially, President Macron was right. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, exactly saying that President Macron's ideas about strategic autonomy were going in the right direction. They all want to caution that, there is this fear that having EU military command and control would be overlapping with NATO. But what they'll always say when somebody brings that up is that it's in addition to NATO. NATO would be better off with an equal US and EU power. So you would have the EU coordinating its military. It's just like the US coordinates its military. They would be equal partners rather than a relationship where the United States is kind of running NATO, or the perception is that it's running NATO and that it's protecting Europe. So the idea is that if the United States suddenly disappeared, if the next president was Donald Trump or someone like him and pulled the US out of NATO, it wouldn't leave Europe defenseless, because they will have already built up this coordination at EU level, and so they could defend themselves on their own, something that most people think they're just not capable of doing at the moment, because they rely on the American-led structure within NATO.
So there's that aspect of it, and as you said, there's also the energy aspect of it, and Europe gets 40% of its natural gas from Russia. We heard the French president issue a reminder of that earlier. And we see countries like Germany, where it's higher. Germany's government, by the way, quick to deny it had anything to do with an initiative by its former chancellor. Angela Merkel's predecessor, Gerhard Schroeder, a top executive at the Nord Stream pipeline project, and Gazprom, as well as chair of the supervisory board of the Russian state energy company Rosneft. He said he was going to Moscow to try to mediate. Dave Keating, have there been any reactions where you are on this?
I didn't hear any from leaders coming in, but of course this is massively embarrassing for Chancellor Scholz, who says he didn't know anything about this, but this is the former leader of his party, the former chancellor, who has long come in for criticism for sitting on that board in the first place. Now, supposedly he was asked to do this by Ukrainian President Zelensky, but it's hard to see where he would fit in here, because he certainly doesn't speak for the German government. He is widely discredited in Germany these days. So I think this news came as a surprise to people here, and certainly to the German leadership doesn't want to talk about it. I didn't hear any leaders bring this up as they came into Versailles today, though.
Leslie Vasenko, there is a need for mediation at some point, and we heard in several interviews this week Ukraine's president offer concessions in discussions with Russia on issues like NATO, softening of stance, if you will. Who's the right party right now to act as mediator? We saw today how the first negotiations between the foreign ministers of Russia and Ukraine went nowhere in Turkey.
Yeah, I don't think that they could go anywhere. The position of the Russian representative was clearly that they just want the Ukrainian government to capitulate, and they were not even prepared to give a green humanitarian corridor for people to leave Mariupol, a town in the east of Ukraine, which is being heavily bombarded for 8 days now, and where civilians are being besieged by Russian armed forces, not allowing to leave the city, where there is no more food, where there's no more water, and where there's no heat supply, no electricity, and people essentially live in basements. In one of those basements, a child, an 8-year-old girl, died of dehydration. This is 21st century Europe. These are the realities of the life. And even under such conditions, the Russians didn't see it fit to give a green corridor for the civilian population. So I'm telling you this story because to give you a feeling of how difficult it is to negotiate with a party which just completely blatantly just stands on one thing and one thing only, that they want the government to capitulate and they want to put in a puppet government. Now, these are not negotiation positions. This is hardly something that the Ukrainians could agree on. But President Zelensky is absolutely right in saying that, look, we are open for talks. We need some security guarantees. And that is probably an appeal our president is making, not to Russia, obviously, but to the rest of the world, to the NATO member states, to the EU, to any kind of possible defense and security alliances that can be formed. And we are saying, okay, look, we can negotiate, we can find ways around our stance, but we really need to know that we will be defended, that we will be secure, and not in the manner that was installed in 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear arms and signed a memorandum, which essentially is just a piece of paper now, which means nothing. But in that memorandum, it says that all the nuclear powers were supposed to guarantee the security of Ukraine. And as a result, we have one nuclear power, the Russian Federation, which has actually attacked Ukraine and is escalating the level of aggression every hour. And the rest of the nuclear powers, which are just sort of standing by in the background, totally and utterly amazed at the fact that 15 days into the war and Ukraine is still standing. So that's not the kind of security guarantees Ukraine will be ready to negotiate around. So that's definitely off the table. But the question remains there. The door is open, up for negotiations. It's just that nobody's offering anything that could be of interest to Ukraine and that could provide security and independence of our country in the long term.
At this particular moment, President Ilves, you said earlier, deterrence works. Right now, we've seen this Thursday the UK announce asset freezes on oligarchs that include Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich, and the boss of Rosneft. What more can the EU do?
Well, it's actually started doing something today, which I think is probably the biggest form of deterrence, which is to begin a process of collecting information on war crimes committed by Russia. And the knowledge that Mr. Lavrov and Sechin and Patrushev, not to mention Vladimir Putin, will all be in some version of the Nuremberg trial, which is something that, in fact, the European Union could put together and should put together. And I'm really, I find it really impressive that they've come to this phase so quickly in response to what are the obvious war crimes that we see all the time on in various videos, and the shelling of evacuation routes, and the admitted use of thermobaric weapons. I mean, admitted by the MOD in Russia. That I think that is a huge deterrent, because if you know that you're going to be hauled before the court, or you will never be able to leave Russia, and this applies even down to lower level troops there right now. It applies to all of those who have been captured and say, I was only following orders, which didn't work at Nuremberg in 1945, and it's not going to work in a new Nuremberg. So I think as far as a deterrent effect, the stronger the EU is in pushing the need for accountability and a war crimes tribunal, the less likely that Russia will continue to pursue these horrible, inhuman criminal acts.
And Dave Keating will continue to follow it for us from that summit in Versailles. I want to thank you, President Tumas Hendrik Ilves, for being with us here in the France 24 debate. I want to thank Lesia Valisenko. Our thoughts go out to you, your family, your compatriots in these difficult times. And I want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.